We're glad you've joined with us for another week of Bible study. We are in the book of Ecclesiastes, the Old Testament, a small book, but an important book about life. I'm Fred Davis, pastor Mending Fences Cowboy Church in Lebanon, Tennessee. We're located on Highway 109 at the former Reba McIntyre barn. We meet at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. If you're not actively involved in a church, we'd invite you to come. I do believe you would enjoy the fellowship that we have with each other. It's a blessed time on Sunday morning. But during the week, we do a daily 15-minute Bible study, which is what we're doing right now. We're in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is a book that is written by King Solomon. Solomon was considered to be the wealthiest man that had ever lived. He was also known for his wisdom. He was a very wise man. And so in Ecclesiastes, Solomon sets out to discover the purpose of life. I noticed as we think about the purpose of life that a lot of times teenagers are in search of the meaning of life. Well, Solomon gives some insight on the meaning of life. We've looked at chapter 1, we've looked at chapter 2, and we're going to begin today with chapter 3. But just to give you a little recap on what has taken place in chapter 1 and verse 2, here's what Solomon says. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. And then Solomon takes off and examining life's situations to see if he can discover the meaning of life. And he gives examples of searching through pleasures and the wise and the foolish and all of these types of things. In chapter 3, here's what he said beginning with verse 1. For everything there is a season. Think about it. For everything in life there is a season. Nothing is permanent. Everything has a time, and there is a time for everything. That's what Solomon points out. Listen to what he says. A time for every activity under heaven. You name it, it has a season. So he begins to say in verse 2, a time to be born and a time to die. That is so true. We all rejoice at the birth of a newborn baby. But we also need to understand that for every birth, there is a death. So it is true. There's a time to be born and a time to die. He goes on to say a time to harvest, a time to plant and a time to harvest. It is so true. A farmer, someone that just has a garden that's a hobby, there's a time to plant, usually in the spring. They will plant their vegetables and their seeds that they're trying to raise. So in the spring, we will plant our garden. Well, then there comes a time to harvest. And usually that's in early July, August. Matter of fact, this is the season for the harvest, and we get fresh fruits and vegetables, and we get watermelons and cantaloupes and all of these things. Why? Because they've been planted, and now is the time to harvest. But do you see the season? It is a season of planting and harvesting. Now listen to this one. There is a time to kill, and there is a time to heal. There are times when we have to put our animals down. It's not enjoyable. It is a difficult task when we have to take an animal who is suffering and put it down. But then there's also a time to heal. That's true with us as humans. We may be going through some difficult physical problems, and we go to the doctor, or we end up in the hospital, or all of these things, and there is a time to heal. Then he says there is a time to tear down and a time to build up. This is very true. You can look over the city of Nashville, where we live. That's the closest, largest city. And you'll see they're tearing down buildings. But in return, they are building up buildings. Or you may own a house that has been there for a long time. It's past the days of rebuilding. So you have to tear it down. I know of one particular house that was hit by a large tree, and the house had to be destroyed. It was completely torn down, and if you go by that place today on the highway, you'll see they are building a complete new house in its place. So there's a time to tear down, and there is a time to build up. It is a season of time. He goes on in verse 4, a time to cry and a time to laugh. When people pass away and we have funerals, and it's difficult because it was our loved ones and they have passed away, it's a time to mourn. It's a time to cry. But there are occasions when it is a time to laugh. Young children are in the family, and they do things that are funny, and we begin to laugh. And it is good. Laughter is good for the soul. But what I want you to see is there is a season to cry, and there is a season to laugh. He says a time to grieve and a time to dance. Now, as I was being raised back in the day, we were taught that people don't dance. You do not do that. But the scripture is telling us here, we have a time to grieve, but there is a time to dance. The idea and concept here is there is a time to rejoice, a time of happiness, and we have that time to grieve and a time to dance. The thing I want you to remember is it is a season. We may be grieving, but on the other hand, there is a time to dance. Then in verse 5, he says, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones. So, we may have a rock wall. All over the state of Tennessee, there are rock walls. And those rock walls were used during the Civil War. And they would use those to protect the soldiers. Well, there comes a time to scatter the stones. But there is also a time to gather them up. It may be used as a foundation for a house. It could be a dividing line of property, but it is a time to gather stones. So what do we see? There is a time, there is a season to gather stones and to separate them. A time to embrace and a time to turn away. When you think about embracing, we in the South seem to be open and we want to embrace each other, especially when someone is going through difficulties and trials and struggles, or they may have just lost a loved one. And we want to embrace them, but there are times that we need to refrain from embracing. The circumstances we find ourselves can determine when this is needed. But here's the point. It is a season. It is a time that we need to embrace and a time to quit searching. Well, or turning away. Then in verse 6, a time to search and a time to quit searching. When would this be? You may have lost a very precious item. Maybe it is a diamond ring. You've lost it. What are you going to do? You're going to search for it until you find it. You may get out a, what do they call it? A metal detector, and you may search for that diamond ring. And you may search for it until you find it. Or there may be something in your life that you desperately need and you don't know where it is and you have to search. And you go through the house and you go through your possessions and you do everything you can. Why? You're searching. There is a time to search. But please hear me. There is a time to quit searching. We just have to give it up. I remember a dear mother who was in a church that I used to pastor. Her son was tragically killed. He was buried in the local cemetery. 3 times a day, that mother would go to the graveside and grieve the loss of her son. She'd do that 3 times a day. That went on for years. But there's a time that you need to quit searching. A time to keep and a time to throw away. That's important too. We are gatherers. We like to hang on to things. We don't want to give them up. But there is a time that we need to throw things away. Why? They're no longer of value. If you haven't used anything in a year, it's probably a pretty good indication it needs to be thrown away. And so that's what he is telling us. A time to tear and a time to mend. Sometimes material needs to be shredded, torn apart. But other times it can be mended and it can continue to be useful to the person. And so we need to keep that in mind. But keep in mind, this is a time that we need to see that it's a season. A time to be quiet and a time to speak. Have you ever noticed people that talk all the time? They cannot be quiet. You raise a subject and boy, they've got an answer and they're going to tell you all about it. But there are times that we just need to be quiet. The best way to learn is by listening rather than talking. And then in verse 8, a time to love and a time to hate. Are you surprised that that verse is in the Bible? But it is. There is a time to love. But there's a time that things that are in our life or possessions that we have that really drag us down, and we need to hate those things that keeps us from a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. These are all seasonal. So there is a time for war and there is a time for peace. Our world is filled with war. Everywhere we turn, we see situations of war. The greatest relationship is one of peace. But that season of peace will not last forever. Why? People and nations get into conflicts with one another. So all of these verses that we've looked at in the 3rd chapter talk about there is a season for everything. Nothing is permanent in this world. There comes a time when we have to give it up, a time that we have to embrace. And so you see, there's nothing in this life that is permanent. And so that helps us to better understand what's going on in the world in which we live. And this is what Solomon is trying to get us to see, that nothing lasts forever. There is a season to everything under the sun. I hope you'll think about this, you'll give thought to it, and we'll continue with our study tomorrow. We hope you'll join with us then as we continue to study the book of Ecclesiastes. Thank you so much for being with us today.